Got it. Thank you, teams, for letting me know what's going on. Obviously, we'll try and be back as soon as you can. But I want to welcome everyone to this suitably spooky midday UEA postgraduate seminar. I'm Danny. I'll be hosting today. Will Clayton, when he returns, is wonderful, and he'll be managing the technical aspects of today. So the aim is we'll be looking to do questions for each speaker after their respective talks. And yeah, we are recording today, so we'll try and put that up online, everyone, later. Our first speaker today is Dr. Lily Hawker Yates, I hope I pronounced, who finished her PhD earlier this year at Canterbury Christ Church. Her thesis was entitled Barrows in the Cultural Imagination of Later Medieval England, but she feels she is best known, at least on Twitter, in her own words, for not safe for work medieval embroideries. She has been recently working on a project identifying Scottish sheepfolds, and the project is publishing an open access gazette soon. And Lily's paper today is going to be exploring some supernatural stories around Barrows.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully that will get us all started. Okay. Given it a classic title, Spooky Barrows, so you all know what it's about. Here we go. PowerPoint's just taking its sweet time. Brilliant. Okay. So Sarah Semple, in her book Perceptions of the Prehistoric in Early Medieval England, says that during the later medieval period, associations between the supernatural and prehistoric monuments are few and far between. This is generally the case, but there are some exceptions which I identified in my PhD thesis, and I'm going to talk through a couple of examples if we've got the time. Hang on. Sorry, Teams just sent me a weird message. Hopefully you can all hear me. First of all, I'm going to start by discussing what exactly we mean by the supernatural in this context. So today, the Oxford English Dictionary defines the supernatural as belonging to a realm or system that transcends nature, that of divine, magical or ghostly beings attributed to or thought to reveal some force beyond scientific understanding or the laws of nature, that is, the occult and the paranormal. In later medieval England, it was slightly different. The phrase supernaturum, beyond above nature, was in use in England in the 5th century, mostly thanks to the writings of St. Augustine. And the term supernatalis, from which the modern word supernatural derives, really only came into common usage in the 13th century. And some of the examples I'm looking at are slightly earlier than that. Robert Bartlett describes the difficult and disputable frontiers between what is natural and what is not in the 12th and 13th centuries in England. For example, dragons, which today I think we would quite happily put into the supernatural, were understood to be part of the divinely created nature. Okay, so our lack of evidence between Barrows and the supernatural in later medieval England may well be linked more to our main sources of information than it is to any actual lack. So really, when we look for information about Barrows in later medieval England, because it's really only me and I'm only starting out, I went for texts, histories, poems, which are published either in translation or at least in their original language, because they're easily accessible. What I didn't look at so much is place names, which give us understanding of more ordinary people. A lot of the texts are written for the upper classes. Place names, perhaps it's suggested to give us an insight into the vernacular, into what the ordinary person sees. And that gives us our first clues about what we might be finding in Barrows if we are in the minds of the later medieval people. So we have a number of place names like Scrattow. You'll see two various spellings just come up on the screen. They reference goblins, as do the slightly different spellings of Schockenhuller and Sockerberger. Great names. These are all recorded between the 11th and the 14th century in England. You also have Elfhow, which appears in a 15th century document, and Drachenhorde, which is, well, we hope, the treasure of a dragon, the hoard of a dragon, which appears in an Oxfordshire document in the 13th century. But there are some texts which do mention Barrows. I forgot animated this bit. Okay, so the main ones I'm going to talk about today are William Newborough's 12th century Historia Rerum Anglicarum and Gervase of Tilbury's Otia Imperialia. They're both incredible texts, especially these two stories, which are possibly my favourite stories from them. So in William of Newborough, he describes a story which comes from his childhood. It's something he's heard growing up as a child in Yorkshire. And it's about a mound, which I've included the picture of here, Willie Howe, which is in the East Riding of Yorkshire. And William tells us that one night a local rustic who's had a little bit too much to drink is coming by the barrow of Willie Howe, and he hears some music and revelry emanating from the barrow. He goes up, has a little look in, and he sees all of these people feasting. I'll just try and move this out of the way again. And it says, the barrow is hollow within and filled with men and women who were seated, as it were, at a solemn banquet. He's offered to join in and have a drink by a servant, but he doesn't. He steals the cup and runs away. And he only escapes the people from the banquet following him because he gets over the river. Gervase of Tilbury's story kind of has a lot of similar elements. It's not a rustic, a local rustic, but in fact a knight who is travelling through the forest of Dean, and he knows from other knights that if you come to this particular mound and call out, I thirst, sitio, then a servant will appear with a gold bejewelled drinking horn, which can never run out. It's not wine or water, Gervase says, but some kind of nectar. And he says that it's presented in the ancient English custom. But like the rustic in William of Newborough's tale, the knight steals the cup, and they both actually give the cup to the king. So stealing a cup or a horn in later medieval literature isn't necessarily just about stealing. The horns played a role in the exchange of land. Sometimes they were given as proof of ownership or demonstrate an office held, especially, and you can probably guess, relating to forests and hunting grounds. So in Chrétien de Troyes' early 12th century romance Percival, the Red Knight steals from King Arthur a cup which he spills wine out of onto Guinevere as he goes. I put up a quote from it here, I won't read it out, but basically the stolen cup is emblematic of the knight's taking of the land. So the stealing of the cup in Gervase of Tilbury, at least, also goes against one of the 7 corporeal works of mercy, which were really important teachings of the medieval church. The corporal works were a way of emulating the work of Christ, and giving a drink to the thirsty is one of the 7. Interestingly, Barrows actually turn up a lot in cases where the author wants to make a moral judgment. So I think it's interesting that in this case there's possibly a judgment being made about the stealing of the cup. There may also be a link to the theft of cups from otherworldly inhabitants of Barrows and the discovery of treasure in Barrows, for which there's a lot of evidence for in the later medieval period. Stories like those that I've mentioned may have been a way, perhaps, of explaining where the treasure found in Barrows has come from, although it's clear from both the reactions in William of Newburgh and Gervase of Tilbury that there is discomfort about the fact that this treasure is stolen. It's given to the king, perhaps because everything found in the ground belongs to the king, especially if it's made of gold, which is what happens in the medieval treasure trove cases. But yeah, there's certainly a discomfort about them being stolen. Now we're going on to the supernatural, I promise. So they often have been interpreted, these two stories in William and Gervase's texts, as being fairy mounds. Mainly this was by antiquarian scholars, but also by some modern scholars as well. Although there are several tropes in the two stories which will go on to become associated with fairies, especially in the later 14th and 15th centuries, these traditions don't specifically seem to have been associated with fairies in Gervase or William's time. So, for example, William of Newburgh describes the people who've caused this nocturnal revel in the Barrow as evil angels, or perhaps evil men, by which he kind of means magicians, or people who can do some kind of magic, and they have the power to mold God's creations through illusion. And it's the idea in William is that by creating this kind of revel in the Barrow, it's quite an innocent scene, there isn't really any harm, people will be tricked into believing that is real, and then the evil angels, I suppose the demons and the fairies, can then go on to produce more evil works which people will believe also to be true. It's also worth pointing out, which Jeremy Hart has done on a couple of occasions, that in William Newburgh's story, we don't have any indication, actually in Gervase as well, there's no indication that they aren't human. It's only sort of illusion. It's what we read into it that makes us realise perhaps there's something else going on. Yeah, so although they're not fairy stories themselves, this is sort of my conclusion of them in my thesis, they represent the foundation onto which later stories, fairy stories, can be built once this concept of the fairy otherworld has been completely realised in the 15th century. There's also an association between fairies and the past. So I mentioned in Gervase of Tilbury that the drinking of the horn is described as the most ancient English tradition. And there is a sort of thought around this time that fairies have an association to the past. So in Chaucer's Wife of Bath's tale, she says, in the days of King Arthur, all the land was full of fairies many hundreds of years ago, but now there aren't any fairies because the wandering priests have got rid of them. And perhaps they've gone underground into the caverns and into the Barrows. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly now because I do kind of want to nip into Gawain before I finish. But Barrows appear in this context almost as a gateway. We have in Marie de France's 12th century Lay of Ionis, which I'm not going to go into hugely because although it's set in England and we think that Marie de France lived in England for much of her life, I haven't discussed it much in my research, but the mother of the hero, of the poem, she follows a road that goes into a barrow looking for her love, the hero's father, who's a man who can transform himself into a hawk. And when she emerges from the barrow, she comes into another world where everything's made of silver and the only other person she can find is her love. In King Herla, which he doesn't go into a barrow, they go into a cave, but they meet a pygmy king who they exchange drinks with at their wedding feasts, and when Hurler comes back out, hundreds of years have passed, and I think that perhaps gives us an idea that we're gathering towards that notion of the danger of tasting fairy food, of making a pact with somebody from the other world, and maybe it tells us why Gervais's rustic throws the drink out of the cup. It maybe gives us an idea of his fate if he had drunk from it. So I have to talk about Gawain and the Green Knight quickly, because it's absolutely my favourite poem of any age, and I think well known for perhaps having a barrow in it. So in Gawain and the Green Knight turns up at Christmas, asks somebody to chop his head off. Gawain does. The Green Knight picks his head back up and says, right, meet me in a year, I'll chop your head off, which obviously isn't great for Gawain. Gawain then sets off to find the Green Chapel, which is his meeting place with the Green Knight, which is described as a barrow in words as well as a description. It's not entirely clear if it is a barrow, if it's a cave. The author sort of gives us a vague description, which I think allows people to think whatever they will, and to imagine things how they want to imagine them. But the fact that it can be understood as a barrow makes it good enough for me. Gawain describes the Green Chapel as the most cursed church he's ever come in. And in fact, we have an idea that it's associated with the devil or death for much of the time, until the Green Knight greets Gawain with the words, "May God preserve you," quite late on in the poem. And both Gawain and the reader are given clues about the Green Knight, which point to him perhaps being death or the devil or a supernatural being. And this has implications for the Green Chapel too. The Green Chapel has its associations with death outside of it being a barrow. It's a place in which Gawain expects he will be beheaded, and unlike the Green Knight, that's something he would not survive. So barrows were recognised as burial places in later medieval England, which is something people don't often realise. They did know what they were. But Gawain's to be a burial mound. The Gawain poet reinforces perhaps the reader's sense that this encounter will not end well for Gawain. It's also fitting that it's Gawain's fear of death which leads him to cheat in the various games which are put before him in the poem, and that is what he must confront at a burial mound. Again, there's a link to fairies and the barrow in Gawain. When the Green Knight appears, everyone in Camelot thinks that it must be Phantom and Fairy. On the last slide. So, we're associated with the supernatural, as I've sort of demonstrated in later medieval England. I think we can see it as one of two main areas of interpretations of barrows during this period, which show an upward transmission of the interpretation and the knowledge from ordinary people to the upper classes. The other interpretation is barrows as places full of treasure. I think it's possibly that this knowledge has been retained with people from early medieval England, where these interpretations of barrows and the supernatural were a lot more common. One question that I have is why the upper classes weren't so interested, and why they didn't retain these ideas in the same way that more ordinary people seem to have. I wonder perhaps if it's to do with the Christianisation of both Barrows and of England's past during this part of the later medieval period. Obviously, then in the early modern, supernatural associations become a lot more common again than they are today. Really, that's due to the antiquarians who collected folklore from ordinary people. So again, we see that transmission from ordinary people up the social scale. Okay, and that is the end of my presentation. So I hope it was interesting for people, and that hopefully you have some nice questions to ask me. I'm going to try and stop sharing my screen now. Okay.
Yes. So if you are aware of Teams, there is an option to put up raise your hands. So if I can ask any of you to raise your hands, I'll try and pick out people.
I just realised I had my sound turned off, so I couldn't hear anything anyway.
So does anyone have any questions for Lily?
It's all right if you don't. I won't cry.
Well, I know I do. I think that was a really interesting talk, and it's a really interesting way that history mixes across the ages. Again, what is the sense of history? Because you mentioned that some of these are being linked to King Arthur or something earlier. Are the sense that these are timeless places, or do they have a kind of historicity to them?
It really depends. So some barrows, I should be clear, there aren't that many examples of barrows appearing in later medieval texts, and they're really kind of divided. So about half, maybe a little bit more, have a very clear history. So, for example, in Geoffrey of Monmouth, he has Hengist's barrow, and he is very clear about how that came about. Then there's the barrow of St Amphibulus, for example. Again, that has a very clear history. We know when he was martyred, so we can kind of assume the date of the barrow from that. And then there's others which are just kind of timeless places. They've always been there, or they're associated with this like most ancient custom. So perhaps they themselves are from the time that this custom kind of originated. But yeah, so with some it's really clear, and others it's very vague. They're not, I don't think, unless they have a particular point to make, unless the age or the association of the barrow with a particular person is important, then they're not going to talk about it. They're not interested to talk about it. Barrows don't appear for their own sake necessarily. They appear more because they can be used, because they have a set of associations which allow people to tie them into other things. And that's why the authors use them, not just to be like, oh, there was a barrow. A lot of them don't really exist. They just, they use the barrow because it means something else. It has a reminder of another text, for example.
Okay. Anybody else with any questions? Well, I'll take that then, as everyone is happy to move on to Scott's talk. Again, thank you so much for that, Lily. That was fantastic. So our second speaker is Scott Eaton, who teaches history at Queen's University, Belfast. He is a religious and cultural historian with interests in early modern witchcraft, art, Puritanism, and print cultures. He has recently published an article in the 17th Century Journal, so please catch that, on witchcraft and deformity, and his monograph, John Stern's Confirmation and Discovery of Witchcraft, Text, Context, and Afterlife, was published by Routledge this year. Now, Scott is primarily researching the connection between witchcraft, art, and politics in the British Isles in the 18th and 19th centuries, but he's also starting to work on the writings of female Scottish commenters. So please give Scott a big welcome. I'm looking forward to this.
Okay, can everyone see that PowerPoint before I start?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, and thanks for the introduction, Danny, and for all of you who have logged on so far. So today I'll be looking at a new project that started earlier this year, and it's looking at the various ways witch and devil imagery are applied to politics. So the talk's going to be very image heavy. And I feel like I have to insert a little caveat before I begin. I completed my PhD in early modern English witchcraft, so I'm not an art historian and I'm not a specialist in the 19th century. The whole project started because I started to think about how witchcraft was portrayed in early modern visual cultures, and I just kept on following that thread until the modern period, where I noticed the connection between witchcraft, devil, art, and politics. Before we get into the meat of the paper, I'll give a brief background to early modern witchcraft beliefs, as we'll be talking about diabolic witches and touching on some of these themes throughout. In early modern Europe, about 50,000 people were executed for witchcraft, around 80% of whom were women. They're prosecuted because of the underlying belief in diabolic witchcraft, whereby it was thought that a witch entered a pact with the devil, attended gatherings called Sabbaths, and they're also given power to perform harmful magic. In the 1700s, witchcraft ceased to be a capital crime because of judicial skepticism and scientific advances. In England, at least, witch hunting had been linked to the more radical elements of the 1640s during the Civil War and the East Anglian witch hunt. Many wanted to distance themselves from that. Elite culture viewed witchcraft beliefs as superstitious, but in popular culture, many still believe in the power of witches up until the 1900s. And the latter point brings us on to Guy's work. In the late 1700s, Guy produced a series of drawings and paintings which visually explored witchcraft beliefs, critically and satirically, viewing those who held witchcraft beliefs as superstitious. What you see here is his series Los Caprichos, and the etching There Is Plenty to Suck focuses on three people sitting around a basket of babies, taking snuff, and you can also see vampire bats flying above. The idea that witches practiced infanticide at Sabbaths and gave children as offerings to the devil had a long tradition from about the 1400s. The image you can see, Guy is engaging in some wordplay, since the words to suck were also used colloquially as an expression of corruption that implied to rob. And in a commentary, he explained that those who reach 80 suck, i.e. rob little children. Those under 18 suck or rob grown-ups. It seems a man is born and lives to have the substance sucked out of him. So in this respect, Guy was using witchcraft motifs to comment on the corruption of Spain, which he thought was robbing and draining its citizens, and helps to explain the presence of the vampire bats flying above. Now, at first sight, this image may look fairly simple and humorous, but it actually has quite a few layers of meaning attached to it. Again, witches feature in the image to show an embodiment of evil. And we see the witch at the top left is holding some children whom she's about to devour. And in all the witches, they look emaciated, but their gender is fairly uncertain. The largest character in the bottom right of the screen is bending the child to her will to force out gas and light the flame, which is signaling hot air or superstition. Guy is using motifs which stem from earlier artworks of Hans Baldung Grime, such as his group of witches in 1514. So to explain the meaning of the gas and the fire, we have to go back to the 16th century, where cauldrons were linked to women's roles in food preparation. And so were used to show witches cooking up something like weather magic, with the gas and smoke belching everywhere. In this type of imagery, cauldrons were used to indicate female sexuality, and the flaming torches indicated sexual desire. So the establishment of the witch figure in European visual cultures, the usage of cauldrons declined because they were subsumed into the witch figure itself. So to expand on this, Baldung had the witch's body produce its own smoke and light the fire, thus creating links to fornication, highlighting the sexual power of women or witches. So in the image on screen, Guy's image below, he's using the child's gas and fire to label witchcraft beliefs as superstitious, also to critique the sexuality of his society. And the historian Petherbridge has noted that Guy could have been using the image in engaging in more wordplay, because etching is related to a Spanish proverb of the time, which reads, "Man is fire, woman is tow," which is flax. Along comes the devil and blows. So that adage is indicating the devils and witches had control of sexual desires, thus helping explain the use of the fire and the gas and helping to unpick some of the meanings.
Scott, can I just
Yes.
disturb you briefly there? We're having some problems in our display that we can't see your slideshow.
Oh. Okay.
I don't. Sorry, I don't know if it's problem. Oh, that's better.
Oh, can you see that?
You can see now you've shifted it there. I don't know. You could probably do it, does he?
Okay. If I hit play again, can you see it now?
We can still see it, but it's not changing.
Oh. Okay. It's changing on my side, but
You might have to just do it manually, or just switch between the different screens.
okay. Yeah, I can do it manually then.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's fine. It's fine. So yes, the images I was talking about, that's them there. That's plenty to suck. And then blue.
There you go.
And then the second slide was just some text that I essentially covered. So okay, that's us back on track. Sorry about that. So yes, Guy's use of witchcraft motifs for political ends was not solely restricted to Los Caprichos, but he also deployed them in his paintings produced for the Duke and Duchess of Osuna. The one you see on screen at the moment, The Devil's Lamp, depicts a scene from a play called The Man Forcibly Bewitched, in which a cleric believes that his life depends on keeping a lamp alight, and you can see he's covering his mouth either in fear or to keep the devil out. Goya renders the image that the church is peddling superstitious belief and keeping the populace enslaved by them, as the cleric has to keep returning to the lamp to top it up with oil. Then this is visually enhanced with the presence of large donkeys in the background, which Goya used to indicate ignorance. And then finally, the last and possibly most famous painting by Goya is his Witch's Flight. In the center of the image, the witches are flying off with some man to eat, while the poor people beneath are trying to hide and protect themselves. The three witches are wearing carrozas, which are widely used during the Spanish Inquisition to label individuals as heretics. And you can also see the flames in the hats indicating that. But unlike the carroza at the top of the hat, you can see it has a double point, reminiscent of an episcopal meter. So in this way, Goya is rendered that the church are the witches and heretics carrying out an almost ritual sacrifice to the man, who actually represents the said witch or heretic in an inversion of the initial sense of the painting. And again, you can see he's using the donkey motif in the bottom right of the screen to indicate ignorance or superstition. Just to double check, the PowerPoint's changing. Yeah. So now we're jumping over to England and Ireland during the late 1790s. And we're going to look at, firstly, the Irish artist James Barry. Now, he had embarked on a scheme to illustrate Milton's Paradise Lost, which was ultimately not accomplished. He did produce some etchings, most notably Satan, Sin and Death, which is currently on screen, and Satan and his legions, which we'll look at in a second. In the first one, the Infernal Trinity, Barry's image is depicting Satan as a muscular fallen angel who had descended to hell to confront death and sin. And then in this image, Satan and his legions, Barry's depicting Satan's troops after the expulsion from heaven as they brandish their weapons and glare upwards to heaven. Barry's portraying Satan in neoclassical style as an athletic figure in gigantic form. In an era which had witnessed the American Revolution and was experiencing the French Revolution, rumblings of an Irish rebellion, the politically active and conscious Barry was playing to the themes of the radical associations of it. The scholar Asia Hutt has argued that Milton's Satan represented for Barry liberty, freedom, artistic freedom, and exile at a time when he felt shunned by the Royal Academy. Now, Barry was an Irish Catholic who wanted more civil liberties for Britain, particularly religious freedom. Throughout the 1790s, he had also been arguing for more patronage of the arts and quarrelling with the group who controlled the Royal Academy, accusing them of misspending public money and pensions rather than trying to develop a national collection of art. He was finally expelled for this in 1798 for being so publicly argumentative. So for Barry, Satan's figure reflected his own political ideas and represented the potential for liberty and artistic freedom. Much like Barry, the British artist William Blake was inspired by the French Revolution and demanded religious freedom and changes to the political system in Britain. Blake was disillusioned with the British government and its decadent culture, which he believed to be corrupt, and his contemporary world filled with suffering. His depictions of Satan show him as a beautiful, youthful angel who's watching over humankind. He's portrayed as a benign celestial creature with angel's wings, and the snake, you can see on screen, is only indication of evil and temptation. As Robert Muckenblood has noted, Blake used the radiant and perverse beauty of the fallen angel, whose justified revolt against a tyrannical god was celebrated. So in Blake's art, he's attempting to add fuel to revolutionary nationalism and tried to spur on reform. Blake's art enabled him to visually construct large-scale change and to envisage complete liberation from his existing political systems. In his work, Europe as a Prophecy, the witch figure in Atharman declared, "This is a woman's world. I will create secret places, a triple female tabernacle for moral law I weave, till God himself becomes a male subservient to the female." In Atharman, who is depicted in the image on screen, espoused a religion of chastity and vengeance and exerted feminine will over a patriarchal Christian society. So here Blake is using motifs and tropes of witchcraft where witches represented a subversive characters and were used to speak to contemporary debates of women's rights, religious freedom, and government. And as previously mentioned, in his epoch of revolutionary nationalism, the image, the witch and devil figures represent his desire for social, religious, and political revolutions akin to that in the French. So as we can see, like throughout Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, artists like Goya, Barry, and Blake were using the imagery of witches and devils to articulate their views on contemporary politics and call for change. The political elements of witch and devil imagery was more common in print rather than fine art, as satirical periodicals like Punch and weekly newspapers began to circulate widely in the 1800s. The scholar Martina Lauster, commenting on European periodicals, has said that in response to perceived widespread decadence, devil-like figures were used as ciphers with which satirists or moralists could bring to light the vices, follies, and injustices of one's own capital and nation, much in the same way Goya did with his witchcraft imagery. So symbols of witches and devils functioned as icons with which politicians could attack their opposition to advance their own political agendas. And then the first example of one of these images that we come to is by Dublin-born John Boyle, known as a pen name HB. He incorporated past witchcraft imagery and applied it to the conventions of contemporary English political sketches. In his lithograph on a windswept heath, the three witches are pointing to Daniel O'Connell and exclaiming, "Dan, thou shalt be king." Now, in the 1840s, O'Connell, the Irish politician, was campaigning for the repeal of the Union of Ireland and Britain and wanted the establishment of an independent Kingdom of Ireland. Doyle objected to these proposed divisions, as evidenced in another of his lithographs, which I can't change, unfortunately. Oh, I can, sorry. Yes, O'Connell and the Devil saw an opening that unites England and Ireland. Now, returning to the first one, borrowing witchcraft motifs from Macbeth, in the image, Doyle is highlighting to his audience that O'Connell was the first in line to rule this new Ireland, they wanted to create, painting him as a potential tyrant. This obviously didn't happen because O'Connell's political campaign petered out in 1846 and he died the following year. So under the banner of humour, Doyle was using the imagery of witchcraft and the devil to effectively critique national politics and forward his own thoughts. And just to provide another couple of examples, akin to Doyle's work, you can see the pan-like devil of John Phillips Arthur Wesley. The image served as a means to critique his support of the Roman Catholic Relief Act. And then the next image, Roger is using the temptation of Faust to critique William Gladstone's second premiership as the Prime Minister. Oh, sorry, I'll try and be very quick because I realise the time is more or less out. So yes, the trend of using witchcraft and devil imagery continued into the 20th and 21st century unabated. You see the artist Leon Ferrari used it to lambast Argentinian government. The image on screen, The Witch's Sabbath, he combined early modern art with contemporary monochrome photographs in which you can see the Archbishop of Argentina whispering to the president who led the country's military dictatorship. And the image is suggesting that church and state were conspiring with each other to prosecute and suppress opponents that they deemed to be heretical. Witchcraft was still functioning, therefore, as a repository for imagery pertaining to human evil, and remained a cultural reference point for oppression in the 1900s. And finally, the Irish artist Jessie Jones, similar to Ferrari, used a variety of media steeped in witchcraft history to critique national politics in her Tremble Tremble exhibition. Jones invoked the figure the witch to comment on politics in Ireland regarding abortion and the gender pay gap. As she put it, the exhibition called upon the witch as a feminist archetype and disruptor, comment on politics since the traditional witch figure challenged social norms and represented the historic suppression of women. With the continuation of Jones' exhibition, as rallying cry of Tremble Tremble, the witches have returned, it succeeds in bringing elements of witchcraft to 21st century art, reiterating some of the motifs previously discussed in what Jones has aptly termed the politics of the witch and of the devil. And that is me. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Scott. That was really interesting. First of all, do we have any questions for Scott? Please raise your hand digitally if you are able, or if you aren't able to, drop a message in the chat, and then I'll get you in. Oh, here we go. Andrew, would you please like to unmute and give us your question?
Hello, Scott.
Hello.
How's it going? Really enjoyed your paper. It seems a long time ago since I taught you witchcraft at Ulster. Yeah, absolutely. It's a good subject. Been working on something similar, but for the 18th century. But it's something that hasn't been done. Zika has looked at it a wee bit, you know, but not in the political sense. So I really enjoyed it. So any specific representations of continuing popular belief, apart from the kind of general lampoons like Hogarth's hackneyed images, anything where it's actually not using it as a metaphor or an icon, but actually trying to counteract it, continuing belief in witchcraft?
Sorry, what was that last bit? Continuing what from witchcraft?
Right. So continuing belief among the the mass of the population, in certain areas, obviously.
Okay. Yes. Not that I can think of. I mean, it seems to be every image seems to be very, very specific. So it's like in a specific time for a very particular use. So it's to critique a certain politician. So the figures seem to be like the witch and devil figures are rather amorphous, whether it's trying to make it look like the politician or critiquing them, if that makes sense.
Any popular magic? I've found a few, but
Outside of the use of cauldrons, none that spring to mind. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. There's a good few out there, you know, but again, you know, they're not usually used for political reasons, just, you know, depicting it. Thanks very much. Really enjoyed it.
No problem. Thank you.
So, anybody else? Well, for me, I was very curious about how this connects to some of the early things like Hudibras. How much do witch finders figure in this, along with witches?
From memory, I don't remember any witch finders being depicted outside of, say, engravings within actual antiquarian books. So if you have, say, a 19th century book talking about Matthew Hopkins, and you have an engraving of Hopkins, but I can't think of any in the popular press.
No, that is fascinating that he doesn't seem to have lived that long outside of, you know, the boom, etc. Right. So yeah, do we have any other questions for Scott or even for Lily? Have we stunned everyone into silence? Well, if that is it, well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you again to our speakers, Lily and Scott. They gave fantastic papers. Thank you for Will for trying to keep on top of teams. We've seen quite how troublesome it can be. In 2 weeks' time, again back to 5:30, we'll be having Veronica Cowson-Lima looking at Treason at the Print Shop, John Tyne and the publication of a treatise of the execution of justice, and Emily Hull, Irving Crystal, Cold War liberal and conservative. We hope that you'd be able to join us then. But again, thank you very much, and it's been lovely hearing from you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.